Hey, friend, I'm so glad you're joining me today for this week's podcast episode. As you saw in the podcast title, unless you didn't peek and you just hit play, and then maybe you don't know what we're talking about today, but we are talking about minimalism. And before I really dive into this, I've done a ton of research over the years. I've read books, listened to podcasts. I have joined training programs to learn more about minimalism. And I just think this is such an important topic to bring to your attention. But before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to just think for a second. When I ask you, what does a minimalist look like? I want you to think about that and think about what pops up in your head. Because I think so often people get turned off from the idea of minimalism and they say, "Oh, that's not me. That's unattainable. That is not what I'm looking for," because we have kind of these extreme views on life. It's either you're living with stuff or you're living as a minimalist and you have no stuff. Is that what came up for you? Like, were you picturing a tiny house or maybe a stark room with just, bare minimum essentials in it, and that's what a minimalist is? Because I think that's the view that a lot of people have when they, are just given the question, like, what's a minimalist or what does that look like? And when we look at minimalism in these extremes, these myths of it having to look like an all or nothing situation can be a huge deterrent from being able to embrace the principles of minimalism in a more practical and attainable way. And so I want to help you see how minimalism can be a whole spectrum of things. It can look very different for different people. You too, my friend, can be a minimalist. And in one of the books I was reading, I was actually listening to it as an audiobook. It's called Goodbye Things. Okay. And it's one of those kind of self-help targeted books where, some of the things you're like, oh, that's really good. And some of the things you're going, I don't know about that. I think that's important to really recognize that when you're reading any self-help book or listening to a self-help podcast or whatever it may be, that there's going to be, kind of it's not an all or nothing. That sometimes there's those good nuggets you take, and then sometimes you're like, that part's not for me, and that's okay. All right. That I think is the beauty in embracing this whole spectrum. And I think it can apply to so many different areas, but we're gonna focus in on it on minimalism. And as I was listening to this audiobook, Goodbye Things, there was a sentence in there that stopped me in my tracks. Literally, I was on a walk and it stopped me, and I pulled my phone out and paused podcast and backed it up and listened again. And it was a very simple sentence. And it was that idea that minimalism is not organization. And after I listened to it for the second time, I just stopped the audiobook altogether and like went ahead and let myself resume my walk. But I just walked in silence for a few minutes because I was like, wait a minute. Okay. It's kind of one of those situations where you're doing the comparatives where not all this are this, but all this are this, where the converse is more appropriate. And I realized that this was one of those situations. Minimalism is not organizing, right? But organizing requires embracing the principles of minimalism. My friends, that's decluttering. And we've talked about this so many times, how organizing is not simply just taking all your stuff and putting it in pretty bins or finding a home for it. That's not organizing. There's this whole decluttering piece, which is synonymous with these principles of minimalism. I want you to realize that as you are embracing true organization and you are applying the idea of decluttering and purging, that you are also embracing minimalism to some degree. And that's a wonderful thing because that's what helps you to create that really strong foundation that we've talked about so many times, that helps support you in being able to live the way you want to, because you're no longer burdened by that overwhelming amount of stuff that you have to manage. Through applying these minimalistic ideals and principles and decluttering as part of the organizational process, you are effectively choosing exactly what you want to manage. And you're doing it in a way that you're making decisions based on what your priorities are and what you want to manage and what you're choosing to manage, because it helps support your life in some way. So let's define minimalism in a way that makes sense. There are so many different definitions of minimalism, and some of them get a little bit more specific than others, but I think that's when we feel really pigeonholed into a more, not always, but oftentimes a more extreme version or vision of minimalism. And I found this one definition of minimalism that just, I mean, I'm going to read it to you and you're going to go, yeah, it makes sense that you love that one, because it applies everything in a way that allows you to really individualize the process for yourself. So here it is. Minimalism is a tool to rid yourself of life's excess in favor of focusing on what's important, so you can find happiness, fulfillment, and freedom. It's a tool. You're ridding yourself of excess in favor of your priorities. So basically, it's just a tool that you can apply. You know, this is another one of those things you can stick in your toolkit that's helping you stay focused on your priorities, focused on what's most important to you, so that you don't continue to bring in things that aren't, which then adds to that overwhelmed feeling of all the stuff you have to manage, right? It allows you to feel empowered in making choices about your stuff, things that you currently own, and maybe future purchases even. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but just this idea of what you're bringing into your home, everything that comes into your home, everything that comes into your life, all of these physical possessions are things that you have to be prepared to manage. Do you want to manage them all? Can you manage them all? I don't want to manage all of the things that I could possibly bring into this house. And so I have to be really choosy and really focused again on those priorities, knowing what's important to me, knowing what's not important to me, and knowing that one of the things that's important to me is that I'm not managing things that aren't important to me, that I'm not spending my precious time, energy, and life managing stuff that doesn't matter to me in the long run. That's been a huge mindset shift for me. Have you experienced that too? I hope so. And if not, I want you to just really take some time to reflect on that and how the management of your stuff affects your everyday life. Okay? And so when you think about minimalism, I want you to try to avoid some of those extremes in thinking that it means you have to own nothing or next to nothing, or that you have to live in this stark, empty house, right? I want you to automatically think, When you think of minimalism or that comes up, I want you to think of it as a spectrum and think about, where do I fall on this spectrum? Because you have a choice. And that choice ultimately gives you so much more control. It brings all the power back to you, my friend, when you really understand that and embrace that. Okay? Because minimalism, what it really means is that you're being intentional. You're being intentional with your possessions. You're being intentional with your choices about what your future possessions are going to be. You're being intentional with your money. You're being intentional with your time. Okay, those are all really important things. It's these principles of understanding that maybe, yes, you have fewer items, but that the meaning behind those items, the functionality of those items is increased. It's more meaningful. It helps add to the function of your life. Does that make sense? It's not just about getting rid of everything. It's about getting yourself down to things that you have that now add something to your life rather than just taking away your time and energy, right? It's this tool for creating space in your life that helps bring you more value. Ooh, that gives me chills a little bit. Like, to really think about that I have total control and power over adding this value to my own life. That's powerful. And when you are able to embrace minimalism and the principles of minimalism, wherever you decide that you fall on that spectrum, right? Then you're going to be saving yourself time. You're reducing stress. You're decreasing those feelings of overwhelm for yourself. You're creating some of that financial freedom, what we were talking about earlier about how embracing the principles of minimalism can help focus your spending going forward. Do I really want to spend my money on this? Or is it just going to become something that's taking up space that I now have to manage? Or do I want to focus my finances? Do I want to, pass on this purchase, free up that space physically and mentally, right? Because this all goes to your mental load. All the things that you physically are managing have to exist up here in your mental space as well. But do I want to take these finances then and focus them on some other kind of long-term goal? Maybe you want to travel, or you're saving for something and you feel like you're never going to get there. Embracing some minimalism or minimalist principles can help refocus your finances as well. And you know what also is a really interesting benefit of minimalism? That for some people, this can be a primary focus for them, but for so many others, it's just one of those amazing secondary benefits. It's the environmental impact. The idea that we're able to minimize our footprint a little bit, right? Right along with minimalizing applying these minimalist principles to our lives, it helps us going forward. Yes, there is that getting rid of phase that we have to go through, but then moving forward, it helps to decrease our footprint, which helps with sustainability, helps reduce waste long term. And so that's just a really nice little kind of secondary benefit for so many people who are starting to realize and embrace these minimalist ideals. And so, what I want you to do now, we're going to come back next week and we're going to talk a little bit more about minimalism and some of the practical application. We're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of this and what this might look like for you somewhere on the spectrum of a minimalist without having to feel like you're taking it to an extreme place. But for now, I want you to just take some time to really think about what comes up for you when you tell yourself, I am a minimalist. What comes up for you? What kinds of thoughts come up for you? What kinds of feelings come up for you? What kind of questions come up for you. If you have questions about this, you can always reach out to me. Check the show notes for different ways to get in touch with me. But you can reach out, ask some questions, and I would always be happy to chat with you a little bit and maybe help you see where you can fit in on that spectrum or that continuum of minimalism in your own life. So until next week, be thinking about minimalism and getting organized from all angles.